Hello and welcome to our discussion about fertility in the workplace. Well, why does fertility in the workplace matter? Well, because many of us will be working alongside a colleague who is experiencing or has experienced infertility. It can be a really difficult journey, and yet many won't tell their employer about what they're going through and what they're juggling, alongside trying to present themselves as a fully committed member of staff. So what should employers be doing? Well, I'm joined by three guests who've all had their own experience of infertility and want to change things for the better. As always, if you have any questions, please do put them in the chat and we'll get to them at the end of our conversation. So our guest today, Anya is the Fertility in the Workplace lead for the charity Fertility Network UK, which campaigns and offers support for anyone going through the fertility journey. Andrew Baines-Vosper is an ambassador for the charity and a training delivery manager for the Samaritans, who advocates for men who are experiencing infertility issues. And Becky is co-founder of Fertility Matters at Work, which is also dedicated to educating companies about the reality of IVF and the support that's needed in the workplace. Thank you very much, all three of you, for joining us today. Perhaps I could sort of start by just asking you to sort of recount your own experiences of your fertility journey. Anya, perhaps I could start with you.
Absolutely. Yeah, ours was quite a while ago. We went through 6 years and 5 rounds of IVF treatments. And to this day, when I look back, I can remember just how difficult that time was and how uncertain everything felt, and it felt like life was on hold. We were very fortunate, and we did conceive 2 children through IVF. But throughout the whole process of fertility treatment, we'd spoken about adoption as well. And so when my youngest then was about 4.5, we then revisited the idea of adoption and began the process. And it was a long journey for us, but we eventually adopted our youngest, and he's been with us now for about 9 years. So we have 2 children from IVF, 1 adopted, and it's because of remembering all too well some of the pain and difficulty of that experience that I now work in this sector, and I've worked with fertility for about 15 years now.
Thank you, Anya. Becky, what was your experience?
So I was 27 when I was diagnosed with early menopause, which became as a huge shock. And at the time I was working in a HR role within a corporate organisation, and suddenly I was told that if I wanted to have children, I'd needed to go through IVF and needed to do it pretty quickly because my egg reserve was so low. And so we fast-tracked straight into IVF, and over the course of about 2 years, it was quite an intense 2 years. We went through 5 rounds of IVF, and I did get pregnant on the first round, but sadly miscarried at 8 weeks, which was really, really difficult. And then during that time, as we went through round after round and it wasn't working, we needed to consider a different path to parenthood. And so we looked at the route of egg donation and made the decision to use an egg donor. And we travelled out to the Czech Republic for treatment back in 2015. And that's where I conceived my eldest daughter, who's now 6. And then we had 2 further children, twins, through the same egg donor. So now I have 3 amazing girls. But I look back on that experience, and just like Anya said, I can remember so well those times where you delivered the bad news, something doesn't work, and just how emotionally draining the whole process is. And I think with my background in HR as well, realising that actually within workplaces, there's just not that support really there for people who are going through it. And at the time, I felt like I was the only one going through it. And so I think it's so important to have these conversations. And that's what led me to Fertility Matters at Work.
Yeah. And Becky, Anya, you're talking obviously through going through it physically as well yourself. Andy, we know there's most likely a partner involved, and the partner is trying to provide support, but also going through the process as well. What was your experience?
Yeah, I mean, it's again, it happened a while ago, but it's it's still very, it feels like it was yesterday sometimes. You sort of think back and the experience. So it was, we were unable to conceive through fertility challenges from myself, and that started in my early 20s. We went through 2 rounds of IVF, which both unfortunately failed. And then after a while of sort of looking at our options, we looked at adoption, and ended up sort of going through that journey, which again is a sort of separate emotional journey itself, and adopted our daughter, who is now nearly 9, so she's 9 in a couple of months' time, and she came to us just before her first birthday. And I also adopted my stepson from my wife's previous relationship, and he's 24 now, so I adopted him just before he turned 18. And from, I think, it's an incredibly difficult journey. I think from, again, from the physical and emotional side, for me, I remember it was very much emotional, because obviously physically, the whole process of the IVF and the testing, my role was quite small really in comparison, and with that becomes its own challenges of the whole guilt and the shame and the sort of the worthless self-worth side of it that comes with it, from thinking that it was my fault, I'd caused this, and there were a whole host of other emotional challenges that really affected our relationship, I think, to some degree, and quite a lot. Some of it that I think I could have probably, looking back, dealt with things differently, but at the time I didn't know how to deal with it, and there was a lot of support I felt at the time for the physical side of it and from the practical side, and especially I felt there was a lot of support from my wife, but I didn't really feel, it was very sort of, it was quite a lonely and isolating place, and sort of looking back on it, it was for me, just recognizing the importance of what it is to talk about what's going on and to feel, I think, and Becky mentioned it in terms of the workplace side of things. I worked in a very male orientated industry, so I worked in the rail industry, and the emotional impact, the impact I think fertility challenges have on your life as a whole, and the way, as I said, I felt very guilty and worthless and shamed, and a lot of the time at home I took that with me to work. I wasn't a different person because I walked out the house, and working in an industry that was pretty much full of men meant I couldn't really talk, and when I did talk, it was the subject of jokes, sort of, he's firing blanks, and if I had to ask for time, there was a whole thing that came with it. So so passionate about just making this.
Did you tell many colleagues about what you were going through, Andy, at that stage?
A few people that might have been close to me. I had to tell certain people because obviously it requires time off, and there were days, for example, if when we're going through IVF, and if it had bad results, or if it had that the news that it hadn't worked, I needed a bit of time off to process that, but unfortunately some of the people that I had to tell weren't the most empathetic and tactful, I don't think, and therefore it just made it exceptionally uncomfortable to be able to talk about that, and men didn't really know how to respond to it either. It's not their fault necessarily, they didn't know how to respond to it. It's not something we talk about, us men, really a lot, so it's it's not their fault, but
And Becky, you said that you were working in HR at the time. So in a way, you were in the position that you're now trying to sort of educate people who are HR managers about the experiences that somebody like you has been through. What was your situation at the time? Were you able to get support from your workplace, or you said you sort of felt very isolated? Well, all three of you have obviously said that. How was it dealt with in the workplace at that stage?
So for me, the timing for me wasn't ideal, because when I got my diagnosis, I had literally just resigned from a previous job and was about to start a new job. I was in my 3-month notice period, and I remember thinking, I'm quite an open person. I think I would have really struggled to hide something. And actually, when you're starting a new job and then suddenly you need to go every other day for an appointment first thing in the morning and be late in, it's very hard you've not earned that kind of level of respect yet to kind of just go, I'm just going to flex my hours. And so I felt like I'd got no choice really but to be open. And I remember meeting up with my new manager just before I started, and I was so terrified about saying, actually, by the way, I stood in this interview and I told you about how I want to progress and everything that I wanted to do. That hasn't changed, but this has come up in my life, and I can't not go through IVF. I can't put it off because I need to do it now. And I remember having that conversation, and actually I was really relieved because she gave me a positive reaction and said, look, we'll support you. And I felt supported with the practical side of things. I was lucky in an office role. I could kind of flex my hours around my appointments. But what I did find was that because my journey was quite long and we were kind of going into back-to-back rounds, it felt like it was waning after a while, particularly when I had my miscarriage and I needed time off after that. That was a process that lasted 3 weeks as well, because I didn't miscarry naturally. I had to go in for surgery, and there were all of these complications that I just wasn't even aware of at all. And so I kind of put myself back in the shoes of being that HR professional who didn't know what it was like to go through this. And I think I would have just thought, oh, it's just a few appointments, a few scans, and may need a bit of time off. And what I wouldn't have realised is the emotional impact that it can have on someone. And just as Andy was talking about, the feelings of loss that come with this that are really hard to describe to someone who hasn't been through it, because you've not physically lost anything visible. But for you, that it quite often is, if you think about when you're a child and you think, oh, when I'm older, I'll have 2 kids, I'll do it at this time in my life, and you just assume it will happen. And so for me, I'd always wanted to be a mum. It was the thing that I had assumed would always happen. And to have that potentially taken away from me, but yet nothing had changed to other people, was really hard to get across. And I actually found that the emotional side of things became more difficult for me in the workplace. And in the end, I did actually access the employee assistance program, and I sought counselling through there. I also reduced my hours. I moved out of the succession pipeline into a role where I could focus on the IVF as well. I felt completely torn. I wanted to be that person I was in the interview, yet what I was going through didn't allow me to do that. And so I said, look, I actually said, can I take a career break, because I couldn't do it, and was told, well, we might have some other options, which I was grateful for because it kept me in work. And I think it's also important to note that there's a financial strain that comes alongside this as well. So we weren't eligible for funding. And so for me to leave my job to do this would have had an impact on our finances to actually have treatment. So it's physical, it's emotional, it's financial, and all of these things are happening to this individual. And so if somebody feels like they can't talk to their workplace, it can be a huge burden for them to have. And I was grateful that I didn't have to have that burden, but there were still complications that came up along the way.
And Anya, Fertility Network UK have produced a report this week, haven't they, that very much backs up everything that's already been said. For you, I'm just, I obviously the impression, well, the reality is that it's a very long process. It can be a very long process going through this treatment, and you grieve during it potentially as well. It's not, like you say, it's a very, very complicated thing to go through. Were you working in fertility at the time when you were going through this, or were you working somewhere else?
No, I was training as a counsellor at the time, and that was going along parallel with the fertility treatment and the realisation of how big this was going to be for us. There's that real sort of, it feels like the bottom's being pulled off the ground that you're standing on. It just feels like you're free falling when you get that initial diagnosis. And I was working part-time for a retail place, and I was doing the counselling training, and then we got the diagnosis, and then it was sort of, okay, regroup, what does this mean, navigating all of this. And I just want to pick up on something that Becky said as well, that I think it's so common for people going through this to feel that they have to really explain what it's about and almost justify their need for any help at work. And one of the things that we do with the training at Fertility Network, right at the start is to get people to understand this isn't a lifestyle choice. That wasn't something Becky thought, oh, you know, one day I'll just go through IVF. This was something that was landed on her, and it was a medical necessity. So whenever we do the training, we really emphasize the fact that this is not a lifestyle choice. This is medical, and this is needed. And it's really important for work to understand that, and then therefore give it the gravitas that it deserves and get all of the additional support in place, because this would never be something that any of us would have chosen to go through. It's what happened in life, and then we had to adjust. So work can play a huge role if they can comprehend, you know, that this is medical, not lifestyle, in really supporting their employers and employees. So it's vital that we get the framing right.
Yeah. And the report and the research that you've been doing, I think this report that's just come out, it was the same survey as you've done a few years ago, asking the same questions, and actually just shows that the picture hasn't changed very much, has it, in terms of support and policies set up in company workplaces?
No, unfortunately, there's been a little bit of progress in some areas, but actually still there's a mismatch of, one of the things that I found most stark is there's still a mismatch of people initially being able to tell their workplace that they're going through treatment, but they're not always being honest with what the implications of that are, how many days off you'll need for clinical visits, what the repercussions might be in terms of your ability to work, the need for flexible working, etc. There's still a mismatch with people actually bravely telling initially, and yet staying in touch regularly going forward. And again, that's where that workplace cultural shift can be so vital. If we realise how important, how common this is, then we will get the support structures just by default in place in more workplaces, and that's vital.
We're talking in the middle of Fertility Awareness Week, and Becky, I know that you were in Parliament, you know, as part of a big campaign yesterday to lobby MPs. How did that go down, and what's resulted from that?
Yeah, it was an amazing day yesterday. So we at Fertility Matters at Work were there, and Fertility Network were there as well. And we've been working with an MP, Nikki Aiken, who is really championing people's rights in the workplace when they're going through fertility treatment, and what she is hoping for through legislation change, and this can take time, is for the statutory right for people to be able to go to these appointments. And so that would remove that whole barrier of people thinking, will I even be allowed to attend this appointment? And that's why quite a lot of people, I mean, we found from our survey that 69.5% actually went off sick during treatment. And if you think about, as an employer, if you're getting people going off sick at last minute, it's unplanned absence, where you can have a conversation, and you although it is relatively unpredictable, there's an element of planned absence and being able to readjust workload and work flexibly around it. But in Parliament yesterday, we launched the Fertility Workplace Pledge, which is something that Nikki has come up with for organisations to sign up to demonstrate their commitment to making these changes. And that's to provide accessible information. It's to provide awareness raising, training for staff, and that's for line managers and for other colleagues as well, on how to support someone going through this, and also flexible working. And we're hoping that there will be lots of employers that sign up to this and then start to take those steps, because we often talk about the fact that workplaces need to put a policy in place, and that is great, because quite often that's the starting point for someone. When they find out they're going through this, they look for a policy and what am I entitled to. But when it's a topic that's so sensitive like this, the culture around it needs to be built so that people feel safe to disclose, and that particularly we hear from people who are fearful for their careers, and they're worried about they won't be given that promotion, and what will people think that I'm not committed to my job. And so creating that environment where people talk about this openly, there's an internal support network around people, and there's that ability to bring your whole self to work, is the change that we're really looking for. So there's two things that are really happening that we were talking about yesterday. There's the private members bill, which is for the legal side of things, which will take time. But this Fertility Workplace Pledge, we're hoping that organisations will voluntarily sign up to it rather than being told by law you have to do this. And in doing so, will then feel more wanting to do this and wanting to make this change and seeing the real benefit, not just for the employees who are going through this, but for the business as well. So if we think about employee engagement, attracting talent and also retaining talent, because another one of our findings was that 36% of people considered leaving their employment. And so by doing the right things and supporting people, we can keep that talent in the business and make sure that it doesn't impact people's careers.
And Andy, just picking up on what you were saying earlier about the workplace and this wonderful campaigning work that both Anya and Becky are doing, and yourself by going into workplaces and talking to the guys in the workplace. There's also, if a male employee, say, who's doing quite a physical job is in turmoil emotionally because of what's happening, there's actually a responsibility for employer to be aware of that, really, in terms of the job that they're doing as well, I'm guessing.
There really is. And I think, as I said at the start, the facility, no matter what I think you're going through with regards to fertility, it can have such a ripple effect on every aspect of your life. And it's not just, it's not something you can compartmentalize. It's not something that you can just, right, that bit's done for my day. I've dealt with whatever it is, and now I'm going to focus on work. It has an impact, and the worry, the stress, the anxiety, it follows you, and it can. I remember for myself, it felt like a weight that I couldn't shift, and it got heavier and heavier the longer it went on for. It's even when you look at things like in your personal life, for example, if I knew that there was a baby shower for one of my wife's friends coming up at the weekend, I knew my wife was really struggling with it and was having a really bad day, and I'll be talking to her while I was at work, and because it could be affecting her, or because of the job she did, she'd call me at lunchtime, so I've had a really bad day because unfortunately she was worked in maternity unit, she had so I'll be getting those calls at work, and obviously I want to be there for my wife, but I want to, and if you're doing this, it's so easy to become distracted and to become mentally, it's an expression, it's a sort of presenteeism. Yeah. You're there, but you're not there, and you're really trying. It's not like you're trying with all your being to be present, to be there, but it's just sometimes it's so difficult. And being able to just say to someone, look, this is what's going on for me, this is how I'm feeling, and this is how it's affecting me. It's not like we want to do bad jobs, and it's not like we don't want to, but sometimes you just need that bit of help to be able to step away and deal with what's going on. As you said earlier, yes, unfortunately, sometimes it does go on for quite a while, but the more understanding there is, the easier it is to accommodate and to help and to work together, rather than feeling like you're working separately, and hiding this thing away. Because, as I said, it impacts every aspect of your being to some degree. And as Becky said about bringing your whole self to work, it's, if you're not bringing your whole self to work, if you're doing something physical, if you're doing something safety critical, accidents can happen. So it's important to be able to discuss these things and feel safe, psychologically safe, to be able to do that. And
Becky, Andy was saying there about the baby shower situation. It is hard for employers and for colleagues, isn't it? If you're in a workplace and somebody is having a baby, and there is going to be, sometimes people put balloons and cards on a desk to say that they're welcoming a new child into the company or whatever. How can an employer manage that in a way that would be suitable for everybody in the workplace, bearing in mind there might be somebody actually going through treatment at that stage? Is quite a difficult one, isn't it?
It's really difficult, and we talk about this a lot in our training when we do a panel discussion with organisations, or whether it's through our workshops. But it seems so simple, but there are really little changes that organisations can make just to allow people that space to deal with what we call triggers in the workplace. So for somebody who is going through a difficult journey to conceive, like you say, baby showers, maternity collections, pregnancy announcements can be really, really difficult. And when taken by surprise, can have a huge emotional impact. And so we're not saying hide all of those things. Those are happy times that people need to celebrate, and they will be discussed as part of the office. But it's being aware of, if you know someone who's going through this, and you know that someone's bringing a new baby into the office, for example, give them a heads up and give them an option or an opt-out if they're not feeling comfortable for it. So you might say to them, oh, so-and-so's bringing their baby in later, do you want to go for a coffee? And it then gives them the choice to say, yes, I'd rather do that, or they can still choose to be there, because for some people, they may still want to be present. And it's the same for like pregnancy announcements as well. Just giving people that heads up allows them to process it on their own without an audience around them, where I know myself where I've been taken by surprise by pregnancy announcements and going through this. And I could always feel the tears at the back of my eyes, but my face had to be happy. And it is so hard for someone, and it can really ruin someone's day. And so as a manager, if you know within your team that somebody's going to be announcing their pregnancy, but you know someone's going through IVF, try and have a conversation and just try and kind of put those opt-out options in there for people, so that they have that ability to make a choice and just to protect themselves, particularly at difficult times.
Anya, I guess this is about knowing your workforce, really, isn't it? And knowing the people that you're working closely with. And is that something that all managers are able to do? I genuinely don't know the answer to that, but, what sort of training do you do? Is it similar to what Becky's saying there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the heart of it is you have to provide the why before you can provide the how. So when you're doing any training, when we go in and speak to companies, it's really important that they can understand why this matters. So looking, as I mentioned before, at the fact that this is a medical condition, not a lifestyle choice, looking at the fact that it will affect these days slightly more men than women, that it cuts across all economic backgrounds, etc. Just bringing in the reality and then helping them to see the emotional implications, and then looking at policy, reasonable adjustments, and that workplace cultural shift. But you really need to do them all together, because if you have a policy without really knowing why it's so vital, you won't get the buy-in. And so I think it's really important that when we do any training, it's really holistic. It's looking at the why, it's looking at the how and the what, and then it's ongoing. So it's really thinking, okay, little and often, how can you keep this on the radar? How can you make it so that there's not an assumption that everyone will have the 2.2 children and a Labrador? How do we move away from that to a more realistic understanding of where people will be? Yeah. And therefore, how can we keep that, ticking over on people's radar, so that when there are these scenarios, we can handle them sensitively. And as Becky said, it's not that anyone wants to not celebrate, but it's celebrating mindfully with the reality that this may impact people differently. And so it's all doable, but it's just changing that internal culture, I would say.
And the legal position at the moment, if I'm right in saying, is that, you can ask for time, or you can legally get time off, sort of postnatal, prenatal, is that right? But there is no legal access to time off for preconception.
Yeah, it's right. Post embryo transfer in an IVF cycle. So once an embryo has been placed, you have legal rights. Up until that point, it's down to discretion of the place that you're working in. So that's really hard. That's really difficult. It's certainly something that we hope to see change with.
And Andy, I'm guessing a lot of managers in workplaces are men. So how do we get this message to the male managers in a workplace?
I think this is all down to, more people talking about this and having these kind of conversations. I think, it's like with anything, within a workplace, making people feel safe to be themselves, to bring themselves to work, and don't get me wrong, obviously we were talking about this subject today, but it relates to everything. It's about understanding that people are human, people have things that are going on that affects them in various different ways, and trying to encourage people to just reach out and say, how are you feeling? It's not especially when you look at this topic we're discussing today, there's no quick fixes, there's no solution, there's nothing that a manager can fix for anybody that's going through it, but just a bit of empathy and compassion to say, how are you? what can we do to help support you? Because sometimes it might not be a great deal. It might just be a few things that really, really help that person. But just by giving them that option to say, this is what I feel I need, would really, really help. It opens that conversation. And I think it's been mentioned a couple of times on here about, and I remember this really distinctively, and this came from a male boss at the time. We've mentioned about choice and it not being a lifestyle choice. Anya, you mentioned it a minute ago, and I think one of the things I'll always remember was it almost felt like people perceived it as a choice. Well, if you can't have children, then just don't, It shouldn't be. And it's almost like it's our choice to then pursue, to then try and conceive through IVF, through adoption, etc. And I think it's just people being aware that it's not a need or a thing you can just switch off because, okay, I can't get it, therefore I'm going to move on. It's so much more than that. It's so much deeper than that. And it's just understanding that, it's not a case of, well, we're just going to decide to go and do that now, because it's a need, it's a deep desire that has an impact if you can't fill it, and it's just encouraging, especially I think the male, because as I said, I think the support for men is definitely different. It's not necessarily not there, it's just different because we're less likely to open up, and also men don't know how to start a conversation. My friends didn't know how to say to me, how are you feeling after you got that test result, or how are you feeling after you found out that that this round hadn't worked. They just we don't know, and it's just encouraging men to, it's okay to ask, how are you, how are you feeling, talk to me, and just be there to listen. I said, it's just some of it's really fundamental stuff, really.
And Becky, there are some companies who are making really good progress on this, aren't there? I noticed that the Co-op, I think yesterday, announced that they've got a new policy in place. And interestingly, what you were talking there about, Andy, is flexibility, that it's not it's not determined. It's a policy that is allowing for people to take flexible time, because you never know when you're going to need to go to an appointment or support a partner and all the rest of it.
Yeah, there's some really promising news coming out recently. I mean, just this week with the Co-op launching their policy, and also Zurich as well, who are really recognizing the impact that this is having on people. And I think they're not just recognizing the fact that females have to go through this. They're thinking about everyone as well. They're thinking about partners wanting to attend, because again, that's another thing where you're going through this in a couple. Your partner will want to be there with you at those appointments because it's something you embark on together. And I also think it's really important, which we haven't touched on yet, is just recognizing that the LGBTQ plus community also will need this as a route to parenthood. Not necessarily, sometimes, but not always, down to medical reasons, but for them to be able to build a family, and everyone should have that right to build a family, they will have to navigate a different path to parenthood, and will need that support from their workplace as well. And so I think we talk about this in terms of flexibility, but it's also about inclusivity as well. And that's what we're starting to see from these employers that are really trailblazing. And we're working with a number of employers now to become fertility friendly. And we're really encouraged by the response that we're getting from their members of staff. Even we were at Cadent Gas, which is a utility company, earlier on this week, and we were on a stand, and I remember this guy came past and he was kind of looking in the distance to say, oh, what's this about? And came over and said, oh, what's this about? And we were telling him, well, there's a policy in place now, you get paid time off, there's a support in place. And his face, he looked like he was about to cry. And he said, we've been going through this for 5 years, and I've spent the last few months trying to work out how to tell my manager, and we're about to travel abroad for treatments. And it was just to see the difference that made to him, and how he felt about his employer in that moment. And it might be that employers think, oh, well, there's not that many people going through this. That's mainly because people don't talk about it. And it's like a vicious cycle. Employers say, well, we don't really have to do anything about it because it's not an issue. But you only don't see it as an issue because it's hidden. Yeah. And so I think it's 1 in 7 individuals, isn't it, Anya, that go through this in the UK. And so
1 in 6,
which is significant. So if you think about, you look around your office and you look at the different people who may be affected now or may have been affected in the past. And that's what we find. When we host panel discussions, we always try and get internal members of staff to come and share their stories. And it is the most powerful way of introducing this topic. It brings it to life. But what it also does is introduces these people as like internal support for others who may want to come out. And we often find it's like a domino effect when we've had these panels, organisations say to us, so many people have come out of the woodwork and said, this is me. And I'm sure you find the same.
Yeah, always.
It just opens that door. It gives them permission to share. And that can be so powerful for someone who may have been hiding it for so long, thinking, my company doesn't recognise it. I don't feel like it's going to be validated, and I'm not even sure if I'll be supported. So any organisations listening, if you can do this, it can make such a difference to people.
Yeah, life-changing.
Yeah. Let's just sort of pause there, because we have a question, and I think this is probably a good time to sort of take it. Emily has very kindly put a question in the comments saying how useful and helpful the conversation has been. But she says, I've not long started a job where, although they are very supportive of me going through IVF, she had a failed transfer in June and is just waiting to start her meds for a new round. So good luck with that, Emily. But they have no policies or practices on fertility. And I guess I'm sort of reading into Emily's comment here that she's got supportive colleagues, maybe a supportive manager, but there's potentially the company doesn't actually know how to deal with that as a workplace issue.
Yeah, it sounds like it, and it sounds like there's some education pieces that could be really useful. We always find on Fertility Network's website we have information sheets that you can download and share that can be really useful at starting those conversations. But I think it would be a case of, could she bring in the reality of it? So, would they be open to a training session? Would they be open to some kind of looking at policy, those kind of things, and getting work to realise the long-term benefit of this? This is actually, initial cost-wise relatively small, considering what could happen implications-wise further down the road if you don't do it. So we're talking about loss of staff, people going off long-term sick. So it's in every place's best interest to get this sorted quite soon. So I would very gently just say, look, can I have a meeting? Ideally, and just say, look, this is the reality of going through treatment. How can we make it so that we're, as Becky was saying, as fertility friendly as possible, so that we keep the best staff? So there's ways forward with it, but it's going to take those conversations, I think.
And Becky, I don't know what size of organisation Emily's working in, but is it something that's easier for larger organisations to implement a fertility in the workplace policy, or is it actually are smaller and medium-sized companies also able to do this without a big, strong kind of HR department?
Yeah, I think all are able to do it. I think it all depends. I think the large organisations, sometimes it can be more red tape to get to the point of actually implementing something, and it's got to be on a wider scale. But I think from our own experience, we found sometimes change comes and it's led from the top down, and that's somebody senior has decided we need to do something about this. It's part of our wellbeing strategy. But what we've also seen is some really inspiring employee-led changes. And in particular, I was talking about Cadent Gas earlier, that all stemmed from an employee who used her own experience she started off, she created an intranet site and she started a little support group. And then she has gone to her employer and said, look, we should be doing more here. And she's shared some of our resources and some of the research that's been done. And they've listened, and she's been allowed to actually write the policy. And so I'd say, and if you're in the middle of treatment, it might not be the right time. You might not feel in that place, but there are things that you can do. And I think sometimes organisations might not know it's an issue because, like we say, people don't tend to talk about it, but there are lots of things to signpost people towards. We've got a number of downloads on our website, all about top tips for policy writing and also tips for line managers and why this matters at work. I think, as Anya said earlier, you've got to understand the why and understand the business as well. Yeah. And that's when you get people kind of investing in it and thinking we need to change. But it can start small. It's little things. It could be a little group of people who are going through it that meet up, that then form a group that can then start making change. And so, Yeah, I think I just wish you all the best for the next stage of treatment. But I know when you're in it, it can be really intense. And yeah, I hope that what your manager is doing for you in supporting you can become the norm across the organisation, because that's what we want, really. We don't want it to be the luck of the draw. I've got a good line manager, and that's why I'm supported. We want it to be my organisation supports anyone who's going through fertility treatment, regardless of the reasons why.
Yeah. Emily, we wish you all the best with your treatment, and as Becky and Anya and Andy will be advocating, is maybe there is something that you can do to spread the word in your workplace once you're comfortable with your own situation. So we do wish you all the best there. Perhaps we could sort of wrap up by sort of thinking about, the sort of salient pieces of advice then that you would want to leave our viewers with today. Anya, what the campaign continues, and and the campaigns are working. It seems to be more growing recognition around this subject, and workplaces are starting to prick up their ears about this. But what would your sort of main piece of advice be as we end this conversation today?
Yeah, absolutely. That this is more common than maybe you might have realised. It's more all-consuming that you might have realised as well, and therefore the impact in work can be bigger than potentially people realise. And because of that, it's in everyone's best interests, micro level of it being best for the individual, macro level best for the whole system and the whole workplace to get this right. And so it doesn't matter whether you're a small or a large UK or international business, it's in everyone's best interest to make sure you are supporting your team as much as possible when facing fertility issues.
Andy, what would you be saying?
It's difficult to follow that. I think it's exactly the same. I think it's the biggest thing for me, and exactly as it's all consuming. It affects every part and every inch of personal and work life, I think, and it affects us as people. And as I said, looking back on how I felt, the guilt, the shame, the embarrassment, the anxiety, it took me into a period of depression. These aren't things that you can switch off before you enter work. And if you go in and, for example, if you make a mistake because you're distracted, even if it's not something safety critical, but you're making mistakes because you're not fully focused, that only adds to your feelings of your low self-worth, your low self-esteem, your the guilt that you're affecting work, and the worry that are work going to then fire me, or are they going to move me, because then it has an additional stress on everything else. And it's just this it really is. I think it's just employers realizing the effect it has on people, and just giving them the time and space, and also making sure that there's that emotional support there, things like the mental health first aiders, the EAPs, all of these things that are there to also help people going through it, because we're not all counsellors, we're not all there but it's knowing where to signpost people to and having that awareness. So yeah, I think for me that would probably be it.
And Becky, I noticed on your Instagram for Fertility Matters in the workplace, you put "Change is coming" was the kind of big headline on after your meeting at Parliament yesterday. So, what's the route forward for you? What's that piece of advice that you would have now? Knowing that MPs are starting to listen.
Yeah, and I think I'd say, for anyone who's listening who's going through this, I'm hopeful that change is coming, and I hope that today's conversation has validated what you're going through. But I hope for any organisations listening to this, they can see that there is change coming, and there's a real opportunity to be at the forefront of that, and to be one of these trailblazing organisations setting the example to others as to how to really look after your staff, regardless of what life stage they're going through. And we've seen so much positive change around menopause in the past 5 years. That has really paved the way for organisations to see the real benefits that they can have from focusing on these specific areas of well-being. And actually, fertility is quite vast. It's not a very niche area. There's so many different aspects of it. So I would say, in terms of advice, you can't know everything. It's a very sensitive topic, and I know many will be fearful of trying to get it right and not wanting to say the wrong thing. And so get support from organisations who understand it, like Fertility Matters at Work or Fertility Network UK, who can really come and bring this to life within your organisation. And there are so many positive conversations happening out there. I mean, just look in the press this week around the Co-op and Zurich and what's been said about those companies that are really truly looking after their staff. And I was actually chatting to a lady who worked for Zurich yesterday at the event, and she was saying that their absence levels haven't gone up, or they've not lost out on any money through allowing these people time off. But what it has done is brought that extra benefit of people feeling more engaged, and they feel more valued by their employer. And so by saying to people you can take X amount of time off for fertility treatment doesn't always mean they're going to take it all. It just means that they feel valued, that you know that you've got that trust there that you give to them and they'll give back to you as well. It's that two-way process. And so, I hope that it's inspired organisations to think differently about this topic and do something.
Brilliant. Well, thank you for those wonderful pieces of advice, and as well as sharing the recording of this discussion with everybody who's watching, so you can watch it again or share it with colleagues and friends. It will be on demand on our employee wellbeing platform as well, and we have a whole range of content on that platform about fertility, and obviously signposts to the charities and organisations that Anya and Becky work for. That employee wellbeing platform is all about helping you overcome the challenges that you face in life. If you want to know a little bit more, you can go to our website and you can follow us on our social media channels. And as I say, this recording will pop onto our YouTube channel when it's uploaded, and we'll be sending that out to everybody who registered to take part today. Thank you very much for coming on this call and for chatting to me today, Anya, Becky and Andy. I really appreciate it. You've been so honest in the things that you've shared with us, and you've all had very difficult journeys over the last few years, but we really appreciate you sharing them, and also the learnings that people can take from them. So keep doing the great work you're doing. And thank you everybody for taking part. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.